particular forum is entitled Slavery and Its Variants, and it promises to be a great program. Our presenter is Richard Harvey, who is an instructor at the Seniors Program and has taught elsewhere, but we have been fortunate to have him teach in the Seniors Program since 2004. He teaches both issues related to psychotherapy as well as literature, and is equally comfortable, I would say, in either of those subjects. He comes from South Africa, has been in Canada for quite a number of years, and has both master's degrees in psychology and English literature. The English literature was first, and the psychology was a later addition. I noticed in his resume that he also finds time to volunteer. I'm not sure how, but I know that he has some political activism in his blood, and I'm just excited to present to you today Richard Harvey, and I know we're in for a treat, and enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks, Roz. My volunteering is not in activism, it's in a swimming group. So I believe in this talk, which is about slavery, I actually have what might be called a captive audience. There's a kind of elegance in that, and I promise to emancipate you after about 30 or 40 minutes. You'll then be free. We'll establish a different kind of relationship, but in the meantime, I'm the boss. So right at the beginning, I'd like to strongly discourage you from owning slaves. Don't own even one. I urge you this very seriously. A slave is inconvenient, very dangerous, unpredictable. A slave's opinion of you is not encouraging. It's not positive. A slave will harbor feelings of ill will towards you. I can almost guarantee that. To own a slave is an impediment in your life. And if you own one, you are not free. You are committed, moreover, to all sorts of costs: food, clothing, accommodation, leisure. The leisure can be curtailed, of course, to some degree, but nevertheless, there are medical expenses, there's a funeral, endless trouble, and no thankfulness. Quite the contrary. A rage that can easily turn murderous. So if you must own something, it would be far better even to own a dragon. With a dragon, you know what to expect more or less: fire coming out its nose, sting in its tail, sharp claws, but it can be relied on to find its own food, and they seem to be affectionate. The main downside in Vancouver is if you're looking for accommodation. You know the rule: no smoking, no pet. You'd find it really hard to get a place to stay. It's a mess when it dies, cleanup costs, cartage. But as I say, even with those drawbacks, a dragon is still a better option than owning a slave. Correspondingly, I very strongly advise against being a slave. It's bound to be limiting in one way or another. The bottom line here is that a slave's decision counts for less than those of its master. And at no time can you be sure what the decision of your master will be. Should you prove unmanageable, soon you will be, as they say, sold down the river. What that means, in other words, is to an even more unscrupulous owner. Now, I don't really believe that what I have said can seriously be challenged. These recommendations, then, not to be a slave and not to own slaves, these recommendations are so grounded on evident truths, are so sensible, so much a matter of common sense, that it is a real wonder why in the world slavery has been so widespread, has lasted so long, has inconvenienced so many millions of people, shows so little sign of disappearing. Despite its being dehumanizing, undignified, intensely cruel, and in so many ways inconvenient, slavery has in fact been the support of just about every society, every culture, every civilization, every empire, every colonial power, and it is at the base of the massive entities we have inherited in today's world. The Soviet Gulag, Chinese productivity, and the largest exploitative mechanism ever devised by man, the international corporations and financial capital. And good gracious, we seem in so many ways in ignorance, in a condition of ignorance, possibly in denial about slavery, as if it were a pity and an abuse, but of little relevance to us in this modern world. Well, it's worth knowing about. When do you suppose it started? It already had a career by the time recorded history begins. I'm enslaved to this machine, and it's actually not working on the screen. Can a technician help me here? Oh, there we go. I'm going to show you this picture. This is a cuneiform contract directing the relations between a master and slave about 3,000 years BC. It's a cuneiform, it's in clay, it's well preserved, it's really hard for us to read, but that's what it is. It's a contract, a slave contract, many, many years ago. Here's another one, if I can find it. No, that's the same one. This one. That is in the Han Dynasty. Does anybody know the year of the Han Dynasty? I think it was about 700 AD, 700 AD. This too is a contract directing the relations between a slave owner and a slave. You see, I spoke about entertainment. I'm giving you your entertainment here with these pictures. Here we have a Roman slave market. You can see the slaves have things around their neck. And that was pretty long ago. This is a slave raid somewhere in Middle Europe. I think the Huns and the Tartars were involved. Here, too, is a slave market. I believe the slave is the one without clothes, having her teeth examined. That's a painting. And here's one from Middle South Americas, a group of Aboriginal slaves being escorted to the city. Now, I've just taken a list from Wikipedia. It's a pretty thorough and interesting site, and I'm just going to go through a little bit of this to show you that slavery has the patina of real age and is consistently employed throughout the centuries. So the Sumerian Code, which is 2100 BC, is the oldest known tablet containing a law code surviving to today, containing laws regarding slaves. Then there's the Code of Hammurabi, 1760 BC, stated that death was prescribed for anyone who helped a slave to escape, as well as for anyone who sheltered a fugitive. The Bible itself refers to slavery as an established institution. Hittite texts from Anatolia include laws regulating the institution of slavery. In Egypt, there was private ownership of slaves captured in war and given by the king to their captor, certainly occurred at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, 1550. Sales of slaves occurred in the 25th dynasty and contracts of servitude survive from the 26th dynasty, which is about 672 BC. And from the reign of Darius, apparently such a contract then required the consent of the slave. So the slave had to consent to be a slave, but if he didn't consent, then he was consigned to his grave. In the medieval, that's ancient times. Now we come to the medieval period. The Arab slave trade lasted more than a millennium. Slaves in the Arab world came from many different regions, including sub-Saharan Africa, Caucasus, Central Asia, that was mainly Tartars, and Central and Eastern Europe. Ibn Battuta, who is a medieval scholar, I believe he lived in Egypt, he states that several times that he was given or purchased slaves. The Arab slave trade is thought to have originated with trans-Saharan slavery. Arab, Indian, and Oriental traders were involved in the capture and transport of slaves northward across the Sahara Desert and the Indian Ocean region into Arabia and the Middle East. Persia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. The slave trade from East Africa to Arabia was dominated by Arab and African traders in the coastal cities of Zanzibar. Tens of thousands of black African slaves were imported to Lower Iraq, where they may have, according to Richard Helly, constituted at least a half of the total population there in the 9th and 10th centuries AD. At the same time, many tens of thousands of slaves in the region were also imported from Central Asia and the Caucasus. Some historians estimate that between 11 and 17 million slaves crossed the Red Seas, Indian Ocean, and Sahara Desert from 1650 to 1900 AD. The Moors, starting in the 18th century, raided coastal areas around the Mediterranean. I'll come to that in a minute. So the Mediterranean theater is really important for slavery, and so is the Atlantic trade. And it just goes on and on. Some researchers estimate that altogether more than 3 million people, predominantly Ukrainians, but also Circassians, Russians, Belarusians, Poles, and Jews, were captured and enslaved during the time of the Crimean Khanate. Russian conquest of the Crimea led to the abolition of slavery by the 1780s. And of course, by that time, Russia itself was famous for its serfdom, which is another form of slavery, of course. So, as I say, it just goes on and on. And that's just, that doesn't include modern times. Okay, so we should come to the actual theaters that have been. So many societies have engaged in it, have relied on it, have used slaves, and have traded slaves. It's like the air all around us. It's there, it's here, it's palpable. Actually, reverting to how I began, it's a mistake to say, don't own a slave until we have questioned the concept of ownership, because this is the nub. This is what lies at the heart of the mystery. It's a curious concept altogether, the concept of ownership. How do you own a person? How do you own anything? What actually is it that is owned? And how do we see this peculiar relationship that is called a relationship of ownership? Slavery clearly involves a relationship of some kind, but what kind? And among all the varieties of captivity, what is the common element? What is it that makes slavery slavery? When we explore the relationship, the back and forth of person to person, we get one picture, a picture of very complicated feelings: power, resentment, revenge, contempt, equality, inequality. And it is here precisely that a wrong turn is made in our thinking. And we regard slavery with pity, regret, disgust, and so on, all of which in effect conceal what really is going on and makes it difficult to deal with the practice. Slavery is not about a relationship between persons in that way. It is not really about master and slave. It's not about human rights or the lack of rights. it is not in the first instance a question of personal relations at all. What the slave owner is interested in is not the slave, but the amount of energy, the actual usability of the slave, what can be got out of him or her in the way of value. So what the slaveholder really wants is the captive's energy, his labor. He does not desire the slave, he desires the slave's hands, his power to work. And this must be drawn out of him by whatever means necessary: fear, damage, torture, whipping, chains, threats, and the very real proximity all the time of death. And likewise, slave trading relies on this first principle correspondingly. There is a profit to be made in trading where the commodity itself has a usefulness that can be transferred to the buyer. Thus, trading relies on the same end purpose as slavery itself, the exploitation of human energy. I suppose the original model of the kind of relationship I am depicting is called cannibalism. The cannibal gains direct access to the energy resources of the captive by eating him up. That is really the blueprint on which slavery is shaped and developed. Slavery is a sophisticated way, a long drawn-out way of eating the captive, eating him alive. And being eaten, the captive's energy gets transferred to the owner in whatever shape, be it bales of cotton, tobacco, sugar, sex, domestic service, even military service or prestige. A slave has to support the cost of himself and then create surplus value that the owner benefits from. That's the kind of relationship it is. So long as the slave owner focuses on these numbers, he is able to ignore the individuality, the personhood of the slave. He doesn't see the slave, he sees the value. And it is really only then that he can commit the enormity of enslavement, can trade, and can put the body of the captive to work. So I like to see slavery as largely unconnected with sadism. In many ways, sadism is the basis for an actual relationship, even, you might say, a respectful relationship, although it is also to be discouraged. So here is a way of looking into the heart of slavery. Let's say a slave costs X dollars, an amount reflecting cost of capture, wages of the guards, food consumed, transport, housing, and so on. And the slave, whose costs are X dollars, the slave is capable of generating by his work the amount of X plus 1 over the period of a year. Then the owner gains the surplus of 1, which might be a very great amount indeed. It might be $1, it might be $100, might be $1,000, might be $1 million. But whatever it is, that is the surplus. And it is in the surplus that the owner is interested, not in the slave. And so it makes sense to look at slavery not as a human relationship, but as a distinct and separate mode of production, a way of exploiting labor in order to create a surplus, which is to say a profit. So I'm going to look briefly at two different production methods and how they consequently involve different styles of use of slaves, but how in the end they manifest the same kind of accumulative theft of wealth, a theft by the owner from the slave. First of all, the Mediterranean. In the 16th century, the Mediterranean was a theater of piracy. In other words, wealth was not a matter of growing crops or of manufacture, but it was gained by the plunder of others, by attack from armed men. It is not quite hunter-gatherer, but pillage and raiding. Captives were taken and either exploited for their labor or else they were held for ransom. So Christian pirates captured Muslims and Muslim pirates captured Christians across because Christianity is on the northern part of the Mediterranean and Islam is in the southern part of the Mediterranean. And they both had powerful fleets of galleys and ships and corsair boats, and they mutually raided across the Mediterranean. So the Muslims were capturing Christians either at sea or in the southern villages of Europe, and the Christians were capturing Muslims along the northern African coast. So the two of them were doing exactly the same thing. They were both pirates. Drake himself was a pirate, a famous pirate, and that's what they were doing. They were siphoning off the wealth that had been generated by those particular villages or carried in those particular ships. A really significant, interesting person captured in this region was the writer Cervantes. You probably know of him. He is the writer who wrote Don Quixote, first and still the greatest novel in the English language. I'll give you at once an illustration of what I said earlier about the inconvenience of owning a slave. First, the captive's grief and resentment about being caught, and second, the difficulty experienced by an owner whose captive is stubbornly resistant. We don't have very much in the way of recorded sentiments. Clearly, pen and paper were not freely available to enslaved persons, but luckily, this prolific and great author, Cervantes, later wrote a good deal concerning his capture and enslavement. So he was traveling back from Italy to Spain after serving in the Holy Alliance, which was a Christian army against the Muslims. He was a war hero. He carried letters of recommendation to the King of Spain, Philip. And his ship, named the Sol, was attacked, and he came into the possession of Barbary corsairs. Those are pirates. And this is his version of how he then felt. It comes from a play he later wrote about slavery called Slaves in Algiers. I think I've got a picture of Algiers here. There it is. It's a walled fortress city. This is the ship entrance. There are walls all around. It was very, very heavily fortified. It was famous for being the center of corsair activity. Millions of people went through Algiers, and then either they were worked there or held for ransom, or they were shipped up to Constantinople, to Istanbul. Anyway, this is what Cervantes puts into the mouth of the hero of this particular play called Slaves in Algiers. And this describes his feelings at being a captive, at being taken prisoner, being possessed by some other human being. He says, it's a kind of versified expression here. When I arrived in chains and saw the place notorious in the world, whose teat suckles fierce swarms of pirate race, my bitter grief found no rest, and ere I knew, tears flowed at their ease down my haggard cheeks, unrepressed. My straining eyes were fixed upon the seas, the strand and hill, which you saw there. My tears stinging with fire and shame, appalled at that disastrous day. So these are the feelings of a person, a free person, taken into captivity. By the way, the Swahili word for captured by slavers and the scattering of people is maafa, which means unmitigated disaster. And that's what Cervantes is describing, an unmitigated disaster. Well, he was held for quite a long time, 6 years, before his very poor family managed to ransom him. And during that time, he tried to escape no less than 3 times, subject to torture, beatings, chainings, death, and for some miraculous reason, he wasn't touched. somehow his personality put him beyond the ordinary rules of enslavement. And as to his compliance with the condition of captivity, one of the characters in the play, namely the Bey or governor of Algiers, has this to say about Cervantes as a captive. He says, "You cannot tame him, for he is Spanish, and not all your gifts, your rages, your punishments, your promises can make him turn from his intention. How little you know the stubborn swine, obstinate, fierce, proud, arrogant, opinionated, indomitable, and bold." So that's the impression he created in the hearts of his captors. So didn't I tell you, don't go in for owning a slave? Captives in Algiers were held partly for ransom, partly to row the galleys that were bent on further piracy and loot. The mode of production in this theatre was not production of goods, agriculture, services, but rather it was based on raid and capture, so that the productive capacity of those raided was gleaned, siphoned off, a rather high position in the food chain of wealth. The very ironic position pertained in that region because, of course, Christians were captured by Muslims, Muslims were captured by Christians, and they were all put to work rowing the vessels that actually furthered the capture. So that in the Battle of Lepanto, the battle in which Cervantes distinguished himself, it was Christians rowing the Moors' ships towards the battle, and Moors rowing the Christian ships towards battle. And of course, their survival would have depended upon the defeat of the enemy. And the enemy of that, in those conditions, of course, was their own nation. So they were used to row towards the defeat of members of their own nation, on both sides. So you can imagine the kind of chaos that would ensue. If the ship went down, of course, they went down with it because they were chained to the oar. So this mode of production, using slaves in that way, differs radically from what we might call plantation slavery. This is another variant of slavery, which is predicated on gang labor in agricultural communities. This is the one we know best, of course. This is the most famous kind of slavery that we're aware of. I think I might have an interesting map here. Come on. There we go. You see it's a triangle. It's actually a triangular trade. Africans were caught along that coast, the west coast of Africa, transported to the east coast of the Americas, and then goods would be shipped, like cotton, tobacco, sugar, would be shipped from the Americas to the northern parts of Europe and sold there, and with the profits, ships were outfitted to come down the coast of Africa and raid more slaves. So you had the movement going that way, and that way. The famous triangular Atlantic slave trade. So this was all trading, but of course when they arrived, then the real exploitation began. The Middle Passage was a pretty tremendously uncomfortable, dangerous, deadly experience for many millions of people. But the whole of West Africa was raided and denuded in that particular trade. Now, in Atlantic Rim slavery, in which captives were used in chain gangs to grow sugar, cotton, and tobacco, group labor reflects a reduction in cost of supervision. If there is land enough, nobody is going to work for a master. They're going to work for themselves. People will work for themselves. And there was a lot of land available in America. Granted, it was nominally owned by Aboriginals, American Indians, but nobody regarded that as real ownership. And so the land lay for the taking. So it was quite possible for anybody to set up a little farm or a big farm. And of course, that was not what was wanted by the slave owners. They wanted people to work in gangs because the kind of labor required for growing and cropping cotton, tobacco, and sugar is very, very hard indeed, and nobody is going to do it without compulsion. So the compulsion lay in the fact that they had slaves to compel. They couldn't compel fellow Americans. They had slaves. And what they would do then is, let me get rid of this, is put together gangs of slaves and force work them using very few, very efficient supervisors. A supervisor class grew up, a buffer class between the owners of slaves and plantations and the slaves themselves. That buffer group, mostly white people without slaves themselves, who would then be used as supervisors. So they were used in large teams that could be controlled by a mounted supervisor with whip and musket and the threat of hounds tracking anyone trying to escape. When commodity prices were high, and English cotton prices were very high at the time because of the Industrial Revolution kicking into being, and cotton being a very popular commodity, the cost of a slave could quickly be redeemed, and even then some. And a kind of pseudo-middle class of whites without land or slaves themselves was developed to be used as enforcers. This area is probably, for these reasons, also the cradle of racism, as I'll try to explain in a minute. And for the workforce required in this milieu, millions of people were captured, at first mainly in Ireland, and then later in West Africa. So let me turn to Ireland briefly. This is a part of history that's not well known. We think of slaves as mostly colored, black people, but in fact the institution of slavery in the Americas was originally Indian and white. I mean, American Indian and white. Almost as soon as settlers landed in America, English privateers showed up with good loads of slaves to sell. The first load of African slaves brought to Virginia arrived in Jamestown in 1619. English shippers, with royal encouragement, partnered with the Dutch to try and corner the slave market to the exclusion of the Spanish and Portuguese. A proclamation of 1625, this is the time of Oliver Cromwell, ordered that Irish political prisoners be transported overseas and sold as laborers to English planters who were settling the islands of the West Indies, officially establishing a policy that was to continue for 2 centuries. In 1629, a large group of Irish men and women were sent to Guyana, and by 1632, the Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua and Montserrat in the West Indies. By 1637, a census showed that 69% of the total population of Montserrat were Irish slaves. But there were not enough political prisoners to supply the demand, so every petty infraction in Ireland carried a sentence of transporting, and slaver gangs combed the countrysides to kidnap enough people to fill out their quotas. Although African Negroes were better suited to work in the semi-tropical climates of the Caribbean, they had to be purchased, while the Irish were free for the catching, so to speak. It is not surprising that Ireland became the biggest source of livestock for the English slave trade. And we say the English slave trade, but then, of course, it was more than that. It was English manufacture. It was the English who were the slave traders, basically. Now, here is another mode, because we're looking at variants of slavery. Here's another mode, very small in scale, but representative of lots of other sites of enslavement. It concerns a small band of Aboriginal inhabitants in our west coast, and an American white person who later published his journal about captivity among the Nootka. This is John Jewett. You can find his journal, I think, online. It's very interesting. He was there for nearly 5 years, a captive among the Nootka. He was captured in the following way. In 1803, the day before the Boston intended to set sail from a harbour on the west coast, the Nootka came aboard to trade and were given dinner. At a signal, the Nootka attacked and all but 2 of the white men were killed. Jewett suffered a serious head injury, but his life was saved by Maquina, the chief of that particular group, who saw how useful it would be to have an armourer. Jewett was an armourer on board ship to repair weapons. Maquina asked Jewett if he would be his slave. He was very polite about it, and Jewett assented, or also politely, as the alternative was immediate death. This was the beginning of his 3 years among the Nootka. 3 years. Well, while he was there, he was ordered to get married to a local woman because the Council of Chiefs thought that a wife and family would reconcile him to staying with the Nootka for life. He was given a choice between marriage and capital punishment. Quote from his journal, "Reduced to the sad extremity, with death on the one side and matrimony on the other, I thought proper to choose what appeared to me at the time the lesser of 2 evils." When we look at the Atlantic slave trade, the most prominent in our historical view of the world of slavery, we find this troubling circumstance that that emancipation itself was in many respects harsher and entailed more suffering in so many instances than even the condition of slavery itself. So I just want to look at how this comes about. Focus for a moment on the Civil War, the American Civil War between the North and the South, northern states and southern states. Southern states wanting to secede because it seemed to them that Lincoln would put a stop to slavery, which was never in fact his intention. But nevertheless, that's what they thought. At the same time, and we think of the Civil War as being a battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light for some reason. It was a horrible business, absolutely horrible. And at the root of it was a competition between 2 modes of production, basically. In the northern states, a far different kind of employment status was evolving, wherein the workers were responsible for themselves, had to survive by whatever means they could find, where they competed for jobs, actually wanted jobs, looked for jobs, applied for jobs, and worked in jobs, worked their tails off, lived in tenements and slums, produced frantically, worked without supervision, were productive and inexpensive. And then you contrast that with the burdensome system in the South, where slaves were resentful, were tried to skip work, were dangerous, damaging, didn't work well, didn't look after themselves, had to be fed, clothed, etc., etc. When you look at those 2 systems, which do you imagine would be preferable? And of course, the northern proletarian capitalism that was evolving was under threat by slavery, because if people could get slaves relatively cheaply, then of course they would rather do that. And as I say, the cotton price and tobacco prices were high at the time. So you have 2 modes. The one mode being a mode of slavery with large plantations, very wealthy owners. The other being a mode of what we now call capitalism, where masses of people, immigrants from all over the world, flooding the market, lowering the price of labor, where those people themselves would do all of the onerous duties of looking after themselves, not relying upon an owner to look after them. In other words, labor became really, really very cheap. And ultimately, the northern form of what we now call capitalism survived. And it was over the competing interests of southern plantation owners and northern business and manufacturing owners that the Civil War was basically fought. And in this way, let me go back one paragraph. Here again, we have this equation. If a person can be made to survive on a bare minimum and can get paid very little, being put to work, he might produce more than that sum of $1. And this excess, claimed by the master who employs him, constituted profit. Again, a form of exploitation that leads to accumulation and profit. The difference from slavery is now that the workers look after themselves as best they may, are not a burden on the owner, do not require to be forced, since poverty itself forces them. So we have the transition then from slavery to proletarianization. And in this way is slavery transformed into our modern system of international production. Now, the polar opposite of slavery, of course, is a relationship person to person that we may term one of reciprocity. This itself is a complex notion and may indeed take another 40 minutes to explore. I now declare you to be free. Thank you. Thanks.
Are there questions?
Or comments?
Rock and Ronnie, UBC. Another form of slavery too. It's called chattel slavery. It's on the streets of Vancouver. People need to be awake.
Say that again?
There's another form of slavery. It's called chattel slavery.
Yeah.
Women and children are being sold on the streets of Vancouver.
Yes.
I'm a Salvation Army soldier. I see it every day. People need to be aware.
Absolutely. There are more slaves today of that kind than there have ever been. But of course, population is larger.
101, Humanities 201 student.
Yeah.
Social justice, everybody, please.
Yeah, we must be aware.
Thank you.
How significant is status in the whole slave business? I seem to recall in the, to own property of any kind confers status. So presumably, even though slaves may be inconvenient, having a lot of them really makes you seem impressive. Is that an issue?
That's a really, really good point. As a prestige item, in fact, talking about the Aboriginal groups, there's a very interesting ceremony called Potlatch, in which chiefs demonstrated their importance and their power by destroying property, their own property. They would get rid of it. So, for example, a form of wealth, which was copper, it's called a copper, a huge bar of forged copper, might be torn apart and thrown into the ocean. And another form of demonstration of prestige and wealth in that case would be that if the chief had a slave, that slave might also be thrown into the ocean. In other words, destroyed, just to show I can do this. Yeah. So prestige is really important, even though the inconvenience is great. Yeah, you're right. Yes.
I'm descended from Jamaican slaves. I know for sure that my 3 times great-grandparents, one was a nanny slave, so she'd been given freedom before emancipation. The other became free at emancipation. And doing genealogy research, what I've discovered is that my 3 times great-grandfather was an overseer on a plantation. He was a quadroon. His mother had been a mulatto slave. So do you know how common it would have been for the slaves who were partially white to get positions of power? Was that normal?
It wasn't, I don't suppose it was normal, but it did happen. There's a famous slave rebellion led by Toussaint, who was a quadroon, and himself a very, very fine general who beat the French and established the first free slave community in South America. So yeah, all those permutations are possible. Absolutely. Yeah. So you've found all that in your genealogy?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Now we found a slave register in 1816, which shows a 7-year-old boy with the name of my 3 times great-grandfather, and beside him, and he's the only one on the register that is given a last name. All the other slaves don't have last names. And beside his name is the name of his mother with a first and last name. So we are kind of making an educated guess that whoever the father was in both cases must have protected those individuals so that they raised. And out of that came the first high school in Jamaica for black girls that was started by my 2 times great-grandfather in 1892.
You must write all this up. It's fascinating. Yeah. Great. Yes.
Can you comment on slavery at all today in countries like Nigeria or anywhere, anything like that? Which countries slavery is actually legal in and which countries it's not?
No, I can't. I don't know. I actually don't know where it's legal.
Okay, sorry to have asked the question.
Yes.
I wanted to know your opinion about today's world. 2 questions. I see it still as a continuation of slavery. And of course, I don't see why anyone should be surprised. We come from this cradle that you're speaking of. But it was unfortunate to me that, well, it's interesting that you stopped at the point that you did about a new system coming up with it, which is more reciprocity. And what was it again? Reciprocity. Okay, but I meant that you were going to elaborate on this, and I see that as well with this green economy idea and whatever. I think that it will promote. Well, what I'd like to see is I'd like to see the human race, us, evolve into more of a circle where we can make each other rich and we can work as almost like, if you want to put a label on it, a non-profit organization devoted to the betterment of each other and our planet. Do you think we can ever get there?
No.
I can dream. You can dream. Yes.
I'd like to do more than dream.
Yes.
But yes, that's dreaming is good. Dreaming is where it starts.
Yes. I mean, the actual system that's operant now is so powerful, so damaging. I just don't know where it can be stopped.
Well, thank you.
Stop shopping.
Yes.
Can I go back a few thousand years? You showed us those contracts. Who would be the contracting parties if the slave was a property?
Could have been a magistrate and an owner. It could have been. It could have been the slave trader and the owner.
What country was that tablet found in?
The names of countries have changed. So it was somewhere in Sumeria, what was called Sumeria. I don't know where that would be. I think Iraq, somewhere around Iraq at the moment.
Is it possible to get a tape of your talk today?
I don't know. Roz would tell you.
In several weeks, what we do is we put it on the website, so you can download it there and view it or share it with people by letting them know where to find it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The website address?
Is it going to be the same? So it's www.sfuseniors.ca/forums. /forums. That's to get to the forums itself. Okay?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
www.sfuseniors.ca/forums. Okay? There's another question.
Yes.
I read a very interesting book 2 years ago by a husband and wife team. They were both judges, high-ranking judges in the U.S. And And they had come across documents that showed them, and they lay it out in their book, that slavery, the question of slavery, and the right to own slaves was absolutely essential in the foundation of the American nation. That the Southern owners, most of them were in the South, and they believed it was essential to their plantations to own slaves. So even though the British had abolished slavery by the time of the American Revolution, the Americans, the Southerners, were so distressed because there had been a court case in England, and they didn't want to see that happen in the U.S. This Southern slave owner had taken a young man whom he owned with him on a trip to England, and the young man had escaped, and the courts declared him free. He'd got away, so he was now free. Well, this horrified plantation owners, and because of the court system whereby precedents are set in one court and then go down and down in English law, they virtually held the Constitutional Congress hostage and said, unless you agree that we can have slaves, we will not agree to the foundation of this country. And,
that happened. Thomas Jefferson came on the scene.
well, this is before him.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. In fact, most of the founding fathers themselves owned slaves. You might have heard the great statement, "Give me liberty or give me death." That was by somebody who himself owned slaves. So liberty was considered to be a white man's right, not a slave right. Yeah. I mean, the contention between the pro-slavery groups in America and the anti-slavery groups was pretty deep and very rough. Yeah. Yes?
What may seem self-evident, but I am curious, what made Africa such a target of slavery as opposed to other continents in recent centuries?
Probably the absence of weapons. African groups at the time were small, community, village-based productive units. They didn't have particularly sophisticated weapons, whereas the Arabs had, and of course later the Atlantic traders were very well armed. Then, of course, there were interminable rivalries among the small African communities, so that one community would take slaves from another. Chiefs themselves would sell their own people into slavery in order to get musketry or alcohol or whatever. So I think it was the relatively undeveloped, and that doesn't mean anything pejorative, the relatively simple form of mode of production in Africa that caused them to be so vulnerable, and still are.
Well, Cortés came to America looking for gold, but he has the slaves. And they were so advanced culture there that they convert them to the slaves because they have weapons, as you mentioned.
The Spanish had weapons and therefore used those who were already slaves, you mean?
No, they came to look for gold, and they were so advanced culture there.
Yeah, right.
But because they redeemed, and they was the myth, the white man will come. So they surrendered, and they became slaves. And it's sad to see today that slavery in the young children too. This is happening in many countries.
Yes.
I find it interesting that several years ago, well, many years ago, I was studying the matriarchal religion, of little information that was available of it. and apparently they were peaceful farming type communities where men and women worked together pretty much. There wasn't, well, apparently there wasn't a lot of hostility and whatever. But then
where was this?
There was more cooperation, I suppose I should say. And then they began to be raided by a society or a group of people that were patriarchal, more the male god, the idea of the warrior god, and that maybe the question is, when was the beginning of the cannibalism, or might say the economic system that graduated from a sort of a mentality of like eating? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
When did it start? I think it started then.
When matriarchy turned to patriarchy.
God the mother, as opposed to God the father.
Yeah, I think you might well be right.
There's one more question.
Thank you. One particular form of slavery that's being established historically is the act of sexual slavery. And that exists currently today, as we're well aware of. In Vancouver, we know of its existence. And I heard recently that in countries such as the Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand, they're aware of it, but they rationalize and justify it, saying it contributes to their gross national product. Now, if we're in a system that can justify such an egregious act, what can we do here in Vancouver to address that? Because it's below the threshold of our consciousness collectively now, and yet it's still ongoing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm a Salvation Army soldier. People need to be of service, man, in your community, please. We need your help. It could be your sons, it could be your daughters, it could be anybody.
Would you recommend to her that she join the South?
Back everybody here to be of service. How many of you from a different neighborhood, from the North Shore, will go to the downtown east side and do that? Well, I want to see.
Can anybody join Salvation Army like that? Yeah, that would be one form. There's one recommendation. Awareness is the basis of it, and look around.
Change your food. I meant that people's consciousness has to change before that will stop.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Richard. This was great.
Thanks.
Elizabeth, who is going to speak a little bit about the Seniors Lifelong Learning Society and present Richard with his honorarium.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. It was very enlightening and a bit shocking.
A bit shocking, huh?
And I think, as we think about it, that we're all aware of what still goes on in Canada and the white world because of the, I don't know if it's the immigration policy that we should criticize, but the immigrant workers that are brought in for the farms and various other occupations. And I think that's something that we might go home and think about.
Think about, yeah.
This is for you, and thank you.
Well, that's very sweet. Thank you. Thanks.